You're listening to the Lost Geographer podcast, and this is episode 17 on Australia.
In our modern globalized society, understanding geography and culture is crucial if you want to succeed in life. Unfortunately, many people are still unaware of the world around them, which is fueled by media that are focused only on profits, clicks, and promoting agendas rather than providing accurate information. Here at the Lost Geographer, we aim to promote geographic and cultural literacy through education and travel by bypassing the media. We have guests who talk about their own countries from a native perspective, travellers telling their stories in lessons, and related topics that will aid you on your journey towards geographic and cultural literacy. Get the raw, candid truth about the world we live in and understand your place in it. Because at the end of the day, it's your world. Own it.
Hey everybody, so while this podcast and site do increase your geographic and cultural literacy, the best way to attain literacy is through travel. Now, I understand that many people think traveling is expensive and stressful, and understandably so. However, it doesn't have to be this way. Traveling can be cheap and relatively stress-free if you know the right places to look for flights and already have an understanding of common travel mistakes. If you want to learn how, check out The Ultimate Guide to Smart Budget Traveling. It's a video course that will teach you how to save hundreds on your next vacation and thousands throughout your life by showing you how to make different rewards programs work for you and introduce you to sites that have prices you could have only dreamed of. I will show you how I've done things such as book transatlantic and transcontinental flights in the US for less than $10, and how I don't pay ATM fees anywhere in the world and withdraw money according to the exact exchange rate and not get ripped off. Want to learn more? Check out literacy.thelostgeographer.net for more information, and for a limited time only, I have taken off 67% of the course's original price to provide it to you for just $19 using the code SUMMERTRAVEL, all one word. Consider it an investment to learn how to invest in experiences to become geographically and culturally literate. Again, you can find it at literacy.thelostgeographer.net. All right, everybody, welcome to the Lost Geographer podcast, where our goal is to promote geographic and cultural literacy. It's your world, own it. I'm your host, Rohit Amrithar, founder of The Lost Geographer. You can find us at www.thelostgeographer.net. And in this episode, I'm here with Pete from Sydney, Australia, and I am very excited to have this one. How are you doing, Pete?
Good, Rohit. You?
I'm doing well, thanks. And so let's go ahead and get started like we usually do. And tell us a little bit about you, where all you've lived, and where all you've traveled.
Sure. I'm 36. I'm from Sydney, Australia. I have been to a fair few countries. I've been to Canada. I spent a few months there in British Columbia and Alberta. I've been to New York. I've been to LA. I've been to Indonesia, Japan. That was a pretty short trip though. New Zealand. I still have to make my way over to Europe and a few other places in Asia. I've also been around most of Australia, even if it's just for short visits. I've lived in Queensland for a little while, Victoria for a little while as well, and Canberra I spent a few years in.
Cool. And Canberra, it's contained by New South Wales, right, if I'm correct?
Yeah, it's like a little city inland where all our politicians live because it's the capital city.
Right. It's a planned city too, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's beautiful.
Cool. So compared to all the places that you've been to, what are some manners and etiquette that people in Australia observe that you notice they don't really do anywhere else, or that you notice foreigners in Australia don't observe?
Yeah, it's funny because everyone says Australia is so laid back, and I never really got that because Sydney is a very busy place, a lot like New York. But now that you're asking that, I sort of realize why we're laid back, because we don't really have any formal manners and etiquette, Like, I mean, if you go to Japan, you're not supposed to stick your chopsticks straight down into the bowl because that's what they do at funerals. And there's all sorts of customs like that all around the world. Whereas Australia, we don't really have anything like that. It's all the sort of obvious things like don't spit on the street, don't... I can't even think of any, really. I guess the one that comes to mind is don't give a limp handshake. People here hate that. But apart from that, no, we don't really have anything, super formal.
Okay, well, in that case, what, in terms of your demeanor, I guess, how would you say you guys, like you said people are more laid back because of the manners and etiquette, but overall, would you say you guys are quite straightforward, quite blunt, or more like beat around the bush kind of people?
No, I think we're generally fairly straightforward and we say what we mean and we mean what we say. Even in business, I know in a lot of other cultures, they'll sort of skip around the topic and you're supposed to, sort of derive meaning from, old gestures and reading between the lines. But no, Australia is very much straightforward and sort of putting things out there, which a lot of other cultures might find aggressive. But yeah.
Yeah, I definitely got that from Australians, which I personally I like. I like straightforwardness. I value straightforwardness. So yeah, I guess for someone who's not used to that, I know a lot of people, especially from Eastern cultures, aren't very straightforward and they might find that a little bit offensive. So if you are listening and you are from a culture that you know that you're not very straightforward, just understand that these kinds of things are just part of the way they are, and they just like to say it like it is.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And so you touched a little bit on business already, but going more into that, what is the business climate like there? And if I were to do business with an Australian, how would it go?
The thing I noticed the most about business in Australia, especially successful business, is that it's very flat, but that doesn't really describe it. You see a lot of stuff on TV, like, Donald Trump's The Apprentice. And in American TV, everyone's very witty and they're saying all these things all the time and it's very aggressive. Australia is very much toned down from that. If you're dealing with the CEO of a company, for example, the one thing you'll find is that they're very baseline. They don't get angry or swear and they don't get really happy or anything either. It's very neutral. That's probably the best word to describe it, is neutral. People don't get overly emotional and they don't say things like, oh, that's awesome, that's great, that's fantastic. It's very monotone, like it's sort of like, oh, this deal would be very beneficial and we're really happy to be involved with your company. That's the sort of language and tone you'd expect from businessmen in Australia.
And like we said before, they just say it like it is.
Generally, yeah. I mean, look, I'm not someone who's in big power negotiations and that kind of thing. So I couldn't tell you what goes on behind those sorts of closed doors. And, obviously in the business world, it is going to be a little bit more held back. I wouldn't imagine you'd be so forthright in business meetings where, you're negotiating over contracts and things like that.
Okay, cool. And so if I were to enter a business negotiation, do you think I would have to create a relationship with the person doing business with first, or can I go straight into negotiations?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I mean, look, Australia is no different from anywhere in the world where relationships are everything in business. If people don't like you, they won't want to do business with you. And that's as true for Australia as it is anywhere.
So moving on, what would you say are some interesting cultural facts that the audience would maybe find interesting about Australia, about its history, about things of that nature?
It's funny because it's true. We are a former penal colony of Great Britain. That was well over 200 years ago now, though. And, a lot of TV shows will still like to portray Australia as having this rustic backwoods with big accents. Kangaroos are hopping down the street. Everyone has a koala in their backyard. And it's not like that at all. You go to any capital city in Australia and it's just like anywhere else in the world. Sydney is a lot like New York. Melbourne is a lot like probably San Francisco, Seattle. Brisbane is like that again, except it's a lot sunnier, a lot more laid-back beach type culture. All the capital cities are very cosmopolitan and like you'd see anywhere else in the world. And likewise, you go to the more sort of out of the way regional areas and you're going to get similar to other places in the world like that. So they're going to be a lot more conservative. They don't like foreigners. They don't like anyone progressive. I mean, for example, my brother-in-law was at an inland city not so long ago and he asked for a Diet Coke and the storekeeper said, "What are you, gay?"
Wow.
You wouldn't get anything even close to that in one of the capital cities of Australia. But, you go inland and that's the sort of attitude you can encounter.
Is it because they're so isolated?
Yeah, conservative people are like that all over the world, I'm pretty sure. You go far enough away from a city and you've got people living in an isolated little town who don't see anyone apart from who they interact with. You get that sort of thing.
And kind of going off of these topics of cities, have you been to Alice Springs?
No, I haven't. I've been to Darwin, which is that state, but Alice Springs, you're pretty much going there just to look at Uluru and that kind of thing. And no, I haven't been there yet.
Okay, I hear that's very Aboriginal in culture.
Yeah, it is Aboriginal. Look, from my fairly limited understanding of Aboriginal culture, that's sort of, their capital. It's a very spiritual place and they hold it with a lot of reverence. I do want to get there one day, but I haven't been there yet.
And so going on to the next question, from all the cultures that you have seen, how do the cultures compare and what could you say are the differences and similarities that you see that you think the audience would benefit from knowing?
Yeah, so I think probably the best way to describe most of Australia would be somewhere in the middle of the United States and Scandinavia. Scandinavia is very socially, they're very democratic socialism oriented. We're not quite as strongly socialistic as they are. They have a very, very high tax rate. We have what most people would consider a very high tax rate, but we're not even close to Scandinavia. We generally care about providing welfare for people. We have universal health care, affordable university education. But obviously, we get a lot of our pop culture and that kind of thing from the US. So our political parties, what we would consider our right-wing political party would be, for example, slightly to the right of Bernie Sanders. Hillary Clinton would be far, far to the right of where our right-wing political parties are. But likewise, our left-wing political party would be fairly far right of what you'd find in Scandinavia, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I know you guys were an English penal colony. Do you guys draw a lot of your culture from the English other than speaking English, or?
No, not at all. Like I said, American pop culture is huge here. And I mean, we're very much a melting pot here. So we've got a lot of different cultures. We've got a big contingent of Chinese, Vietnamese, Greek, Italian, Lebanese, Indian. We've got all sorts of cultures here and they all obviously bring their own culture with them because in general, a lot of the diasporas here have, they live in their own little enclaves for the most part. So if you go into a certain neighborhood, for example, there's one in Sydney called Liverpool, and there are just a ton of Indian grocery stores, Indian wedding stores, sort of stores that sell all the Bollywood movies, that kind of thing. So you'll find pockets of that where you'll have a certain population and it'll just be filled with their culture.
Yeah, and I actually remember reading a funny fact that there were more Maltese people in Australia than in Malta.
I didn't know that, but that's not surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of my good friends is half Maltese, and he told me that, which I thought that was funny. I guess there's more space in Australia than in Malta.
Yeah, just a bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. And what would you say is your favorite thing about Australia? What makes you the most proud to be Australian?
Going back to our, well, not our political system, but the way we think. You have what we would consider far-right people here who are very entrepreneurial, very business-oriented, very, sort of let's go out and do things. But a lot of Australia is very much like we are not giving up universal healthcare. We are not giving up cheap university education. We want to look after everybody because we have a wealthy society. So there's no reason why if you want to put in the work that you can't share in it. If you're born sort of unlucky to people that aren't rich and can't afford to send you to university, you can still go. I feel like there's a lot more equality of opportunity here. That's not to say we're perfect in that. There's always a ways to go, but I do like that.
So what you're saying is you guys have your priorities in place.
I think so, yeah, definitely.
Cool. And now what would you say is the most underrated aspect about Australia? What do you think Australia doesn't get enough credit for?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. I think generally, going back to what I said before, a lot of the world sees us as this tiny little isolated country. They still see a lot of what was in existence 200 years ago when, like I said, we're as cosmopolitan as anywhere else. We have a lot of really good festivals here. There's in a month's time, there's the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney, which is basically 2 or 3 days of interesting people doing talks. Henry Rollins is doing a talk. We've got people talking about, the refugee crisis. And this is probably one of the underrated things. Australia has a huge variety. We've got very intellectual stuff like that. But on the other hand, a large amount of the population goes to the football on the weekend and talks about sports. So really, wherever you want to fit in Australian society, there's a place and an amount of people there for you that are interested in the same thing.
So you're saying that because it's so geographically isolated that people don't really they don't look further than what they hear or see on TV or media.
Exactly right. Exactly.
And that's the purpose of this podcast.
Yeah.
To bring that stuff to light. And so before we move on to the final question, I know the audience is itching to hear the answer to this one. Is it true that if I go to Australia, I'm going to get attacked by a giant 10-inch spider?
No. I will caveat that with, yes, we have a lot of the most deadly creatures in the world right here in Australia. I'm actually moving out to the sort of outer suburbs of Sydney in a month's time because we just bought a house. And there's been brown snakes spotted in the area. And that's like the third deadliest, if I remember rightly, it's like the third deadliest species in the world. And, because Australia is, full of bushland, as our population grows and housing moves further and further out, you start coming in contact with the wildlife. So, yeah, look, you're not going to get attacked by a 10-foot spider or even a 10-inch spider, but there are a lot of things that can kill you here. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. And so our final question is, if you could recommend a fiction or nonfiction book to the audience, so if they were interested in learning a bit more about Australia, do you have a good book in mind that would kind of give them a good understanding of maybe its history or its current culture?
Yeah, that's a really hard one because, like I said, Australia is very much a melting pot. So a lot of what you read will only give you a tiny little snippet of, one part of Australian society. Having said that, there are a lot of great history books written about Australia. I loved a book called Kokoda, spelled Kokoda, by Peter Fitzsimons. And that was a fairly big chapter in Australian history during World War II, where the Japanese had invaded Papua New Guinea and a lot of our soldiers defended it on the Kokoda Trail because they were getting very close to knocking on our doorstep at that point.
Real quick, were you guys still under the control of the Queen at that point?
Under control isn't the right way of saying it. We are technically still part of the British monarchy. The Queen is still our head of state. But having said that, from what I understand, is basically as long as Britain's had a parliament, we haven't been under the direct control of the Queen. We have a Governor General who's technically the Queen's appointed head of state here, who can actually sack the government. And they've done it once before, but no, we really haven't been under the control of Britain for a very long time. I couldn't tell you the exact dates or anything, but no, I don't think we were directly under control of Britain at the time.
I see.
As far as fiction, I haven't actually read the book and I've seen a lot of mixed reviews. So what I would do is check out a TV series called The Slap. I know America did their own version of it, but from what I understand, the TV series of The Slap was really insightful into, Australian culture, life in the suburbs here, family dynamics, friendship dynamics, and all that kind of thing. So it's still on my list, but I definitely recommend people check that out.
Cool. Yeah. So to the audience, I will put a link to both these books, or the book and the TV series, in the show notes, and you guys can check it out there. But Pete, that's all I have. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, man.
No problem, man. Happy to do it and help educate everyone a little bit.
Yeah, the world needs that. Yeah, so to the audience, hope you all enjoyed it. And tune in next week for another episode of the Lost Geographer podcast. And until then, remember, it's your world. Own it.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lost Geographer podcast. Remember to tune in next week for another episode to aid you on your journey towards geographic and cultural literacy. In order to help spread the word, please rate, review, subscribe, and share the podcast so that we can help create a new wave of understanding in our world. Remember, it's your world. Own it.